Hey everyone. So this morning I'm going to do a brief kind of debate review, and then eventually I'll go on to reason and theology and do a longer review with all the guys there. So I'm going to talk about the debate itself, the audience reception, and then some key takeaways that I took from the debate. I want to begin by saying that I think Ubi Petrus and Louis Reweb were both incredible hosts, and I think Ubi by far has been the best opponent in terms of engaging the argument seriously, and also at least demonstrating an awareness and even I would say a good comprehension of the surrounding Jewish sources. And I think what Ubi has done is he's provided the most plausible, historically conscious and historically conscious set of objections, right, to kind of the argument I set forward. So let me first go down kind of the structure of the debate. So I'm going to first go over my opening statement, the arguments that I offered, and what Ubi had to say in response, and then framing my investigation around just my opening statement and what was said in response. So, I mean, at the start of the debate, I offered two standards. One is that there's going to be a difference between an interpretation that's compelling versus one that's valid. A valid interpretation is one where um, you can say to the other person, I see where you're coming from, although I'm not convinced personally. It seems to me that there aren't any kind of glaring defeaters to this interpretation. So, for instance, when you think about a valid versus sound argument, right? A valid argument is one where if you accept each of the premises are true, then the conclusion does follow. So if you say for a moment, okay, look, I'm not convinced that your positions and the premises are true, but I can see how you got there, given this belief that you have that they are true, right? Well, then, when it comes to then an interpretation that's compelling, what's going to happen is you're going to base it on some premise or shared fact that will either strongly imply or entail the interpretation in question. And this is what I tried to emphasize throughout the debate on why my interpretation is not simply valid or could be used to support a Catholic position, but I think more or less entails it or strongly implies it, which is then going to the second standard on originalism. So, originalism, as I portrayed it, was which perspective most respects or discerns or understands the original context of the scriptures. Now, I base this, of course, off of the judicial philosophy known as originalism. This was a judicial philosophy that took into serious consideration, especially in American constitutional law, the original intent or reception or understanding of a particular text. So, for instance, a common example is in the debate on the Second Amendment, when it talks about a well regulated militia. To our contemporary ears, we think, well, that means like an organized small army. So, hence, it doesn't mean widespread civilian right to bear arms. Whereas when you look at, for instance, the writings of George Mason and others during the time, or even Eugene Volokh has done several studies on surrounding state constitutions. I think in particular Massachusetts state constitution, where they look at how these other state constitutions, when they define what the well-regulated militia is, it's clearly referring to the civilian populace, or at least the white property-owning men. So then, when we look at the text, that ends up shaping the historical context ends up shaping how we interpret it, right? So we start realizing, okay, this is not just a militia. At least for the original founders, it was a particular group of people. But then we think about, well, but if this is based on the natural law, so notice now that we have the historical context, but we can also then start reworking the interpretation in order for it to be more consistent with its founding philosophy itself, right? So, I mean, originalism doesn't prohibit that kind of reworking and modification in order to get at the heart of a more accurate interpretation of what the authors were themselves intending or ought to have intended. When it comes to the case of the scriptures, then, what I pointed out is that there are different ways that we can discern kind of the original context. So, one is going to be authorial intent. Um, for instance, if a gospel specifically is trying to portray Jesus in a certain way, if a gospel might mess with certain details in order to emphasize a certain theological point, then there we can discern authorial intent. and then realize what parts of the theology for the gospel writer were most important. What did they most care about and emphasize? I included other ways of discerning originalism as well, such as, for instance, the background Jewish traditions and theology that formed the New Testament. I also mentioned the first century culture, or even the earliest reception. So then this is where the church fathers would become incredibly important in our historical analysis. However, it should be pointed out that when we start talking about early reception, if you're talking about it as a historical matter, the most important sources, aside from the New Testament documents themselves, are going to be those church fathers who are within living memory of the apostles. And in Craig Keener's book, Christobiography, we know that living memory can last anywhere from 80 to 150 years. So that's why, for instance, if you look at at my shelf back here with the Ante-Nicene Fathers set, I have the first 3 volumes, because these first 3 volumes contain all of the writings that are within living memory of the apostles. And that's important because when you present these kinds of arguments on what did the authors originally intend, or what was the original context, what you're going to want are sources that, if they're not primary, they're at least secondary or within living memory. And thus, scholars don't call things within living memory oral tradition. They just simply call it oral history. That's how important this kind of evidence is. So basically, living memory includes those who either personally knew the eyewitnesses or those who knew the eyewitnesses. That's the strict cutoff for living memory. And that's why, for instance, the work of Matthew J. Thomas in his book, Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception, that's why that work is so important. Because what he does is he only focuses on the sources within living memory of the apostles, the Apostle Paul. And what he does in that book is that he tries to figure out what was the original reception and understanding among the church fathers within living memory of what Paul had taught, on what Paul meant by works of the law. When you start getting into the 200s and the 300s, then, so you're getting beyond the first century and the second century, and you're going beyond living memory. At that point, then, there's a question on to what extent is there still that kind of reliable living memory testimony. And especially, if you have writings from the 3rd or 4th centuries, typically speaking, among historical scholars, that's not going to be taken as evidentially weighty. And the reason why is because if it's beyond living memory, then it could very well have been a pious fiction. It could have been kind of a tradition that arose without any particular historical roots, right? So these are the kinds of things that a historical scholar is going to investigate. And that's why, I emphasize, that's why I emphasize in my own work, right, why I focus on the period within living memory. Okay, so moving on then from the standards, I mentioned this first argument about Peter being the new Eliakim, and I offer the typology, and it was good that Ubi accepted it and acknowledged that there was a parallel. Although what Ubi wanted to say was that Eliakim is presented more as a high priest rather than this kind of administrative prime minister. Now, I think the problem with that interpretation is that it can be both. He can be both a high priest and an administrative authority. And clearly from the sources that I cited, and also just the way in which we see Eliakim portrayed, for instance, I think in 2 Kings 18:18, where he can represent the king, and he can, for instance, deal with certain economic affairs in the land. Or even the widespread recognition among scholars that the keys that he would have received would have likely been, gigantic, and would have served as visible symbols of his authority. I mean, I cited source after source after source. So this idea that it must be kind of restrictively only of the high priest doesn't strike me as plausible, and I think that that's where the burden of proof will come down on why would you only restrict it to that, especially since in the New Testament it's emphasized that Jesus is the son of David, that he is a Davidic monarch who will rebuild his father's kingdom and establish his throne and kingdom forever. So then if that's the case, it seems to me that you'd want to say that Eliakim is both a high priest and a prime minister. But then by consequence, you would also want to say Peter is both high priest and prime minister. And when you get to that point, then you can start talking about, for instance, the prime minister in the Davidic monarchy had the power to make decisions on the king's behalf. He singularly was the highest official in the state and could make rulings that no one under him could abdicate, right? So this is at the same time where, for instance, King Solomon sets forward, he has 12 royal governors over Israel, just as we see in the Gospels. Jesus sets the apostles over Israel and says, you'll sit on 12 thrones from which you'll judge Israel. So, you can have this prime ministerial office while also having the 12 judges or governors over Israel. But there would be this recognition then that this one prime minister, this one individual person, could rule with the power of the king if he so willed and if the circumstances called for it. And so I think then that gets into this issue on, first, how literal do we want to take the reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy? I think that we would want to take it as literally as possible, because then it would strengthen our apologetic to our Jewish brothers and sisters and strengthen the messianic identity of Christ. Because the Messiah in Judaism, not only is he, for instance, the new Moses, not only is he, at least in the Zohar in the 13th century, it does talk about how the Messiah will have the reassembled soul of Adam. So take it or leave it if you accept kind of those sources that are that late. And then, Jesus is the new David, right? And that's incredibly important in Jewish messianic thought. And clearly, it's what informed the writers of the Gospels and the earliest apostles, especially, for instance, I think it's Joshua Jipp's book on the messianic theology in the New Testament. He talks about how Paul has this royal theology of us participating in the Davidic kingship of Christ, right? So clearly, this is not a minor detail, especially since the kingdom of God is one of the most important themes and perhaps the entire message of Jesus. Now, I do want to address kind of one point that came into my mind, which is that, for instance, on one hand, I say that we should give special preference to sources within living memory. So then that would mean that the fathers in the 200s and the 300s and thenceforth would kind of be diminished in terms of their historical insights into what was going on necessarily in the first century. And then someone might object, but then you're citing sources from the 13th century or the Petrus Moshe, which comes 1,000 years after Jesus. And I think the important point here is whether or not the sources that we are talking about can actually have a historical tracing back to the first century. So, for instance, it is true that the Avraham Petra Midrash, or the Yalkut Shimoni, that's the other name it goes by, was written in the 13th century anonymously. But then scholars like David Bivin in the first century language environment of Judea, what they'll do is they'll use it and they'll argue, no, but these have roots back in the first century. And in fact, scholars will often use that source in order to discern, yeah, Peter's probably the rock here because the Jews viewed Abraham as the rock on which God built the old congregation. So what I'm saying is I give special preference to sources that are within living memory of the apostles. And even, for instance, when I defended the idea that Joshua sits on the throne of Moses, I cited, aside from the Petrus Moshe, the assumption of Moses and Sifra Pinhas, I think it was Numbers 27:17 or something like that. The first two sources, so not the Petrus Moshe, but the other two sources, they are within either the first century or the second century. So they meet the standard that I'm talking about, right? So this is not some arbitrary standard that I've developed. And I don't think I'm arbitrarily or unfairly applying it. So then, yeah, the question would come down to, if you use a later source, does it actually offer anything of, for instance, historical value to finding out what was originally intended? And then we can get into the point then about the fathers, but let me continue on with kind of my opening statement. So I think that provides us with good grounds for saying that one could interpret the evidence as saying that it was intended all along that we would eventually rebuild the Davidic monarchy more fully as time went on. And even as I made the point, to Ubi, because he said, well, wouldn't Jesus then be making a theocracy? Wouldn't we expect a theocracy if all you're saying is true? The point that I made was that it appears as if that's what we're building towards, right? And just as, for instance, it talks about in the scriptures how we are saved now, but we are yet to be saved. It talks about how we're new creations, and yet there's a new earth and a new Jerusalem yet to come. The New Testament has this interesting view of things that are both present and yet to come, that are here now, but are awaiting their completion or fullness. So I think then that fits well, this prime minister idea, into that theme that we find in the New Testament. When it comes to the throne of Moses, and particularly the John 21:15 and 19 and Acts 5 argument, I think the only response that Ubi really gave here, and I'm open to being corrected if I'm not recalling properly, was that, that Peter's a type for all shepherds, right? But then the problem with that interpretation is that, when I'm citing these early Jewish sources, or these Jewish sources that, that indicate these parallels between Joshua and Peter, or even the fact that Joshua and Peter both received the same 3 flocks, that Jesus quite literally is the new Moses, right? It appears that John 21:15 and 19 mirrors Deuteronomy 34:9, and that, for instance, the rabbis have a saying that as it was with the first Redeemer, so it shall be with the last. When you look at the New Testament, it's so clear that Jesus is being portrayed as a new Moses. It's almost, though in the Gospels it's never explicitly said that Jesus is the new Moses, although in Acts we find that comparison eventually made by Peter, as I mentioned in the debate. The point cannot be diminished enough that this is kind of the key point on the portrayal of Christ in the scriptures. So then, if that's the case, right, and we see that already the rabbis, with their saying, as it was with the first Redeemer Moses, so it shall be with the last, the Messiah, I don't see why we can't say that with the founding of this new Israel in the person and in the work of Christ, we now have this new Joshua, who is Peter, right? And then what we see then is that Peter, as I argued in Acts 5, appears to exercise the powers of the throne of Moses. And even with the Avot of Rabbi Natan, which describes the distribution of the power of Moses after it's given to Joshua, right? The point that I'm making there is that it seems that the throne of Moses did exist in one person, and in fact all, or not all, but some of the legal authority. And then I offered in the debate an explanation for why it's some and not all. Some of the legal authority, right, did reside in Joshua, and it was for him alone to decide how that power would be distributed after the death of Moses. In Jewish tradition. And clearly, that's the Judaic background for what Jesus mentions for the Pharisees being seated on the throne of Moses, that throne which was eventually handed down to them from Joshua, right? So then what happens here then is that Joshua, in effect, becomes a one-man supreme court, because the legal authority of Moses is vested in him. And then we know that the Pharisees, right, and these other rabbis, as I mentioned with Wolfgang Schrag in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, they sit on the throne of Moses, and in that sense then inherit his authority. So, Joshua has all of the authority, or some of the authority of Moses in himself. He passes the authority along and decides how it is to be distributed. So then, when we arrive then at the New Testament, and we see Peter being portrayed as a new Moses in Acts chapter 5, for instance, where in Deuteronomy 17, in the institution of the high court, it warns that if you disobey or dishonor the priest or the judge, you'll be put to death. In Acts 5, verse 5 and verse 11, Ananias and Sapphira die, and then both times it says the entire church heard this and was afraid. Or the second time it says the entire church, the first time it says all the people heard and were afraid. Deuteronomy 17:13 exactly says that after the person's put to death, the people will hear and be afraid. Notice that then this is saying, and even Oss, who's a Lutheran scholar, anticipates this, that the early Christians would have seen Peter as being seated on the throne of Moses. I think that's incredible, right? So, and I guess the point here is that there's a question on whether or not the Petrine successors could also be said to be seated on the throne of Moses. One argument you can make is that if they're seated on the seat of Peter, and the seat of Peter is really the seat of Moses, then you could probably make an argument like that, although I'm not sure how convincing that would be. I think the main point that I take away from this second argument on the throne of Moses is that this clearly does not fit, or this is not expected under the Orthodox hypothesis on the interpretation of scriptures. This sounds really Vatican I-y, so to speak, just as the prime minister who could rule in the place of the king alone, and make decisions that no one under him could overrule. That also sounds kind of Vatican I-ish, right? So I think the key question then is just discerning to what extent did the Petrine powers transfer over to his successors. And what could probably be important here is looking into just how the Orthodox and just church fathers throughout history have interpreted this. Although I think what I would want to do is I'd want to look into the first 2 centuries to be consistent with my standards and see what did the earliest fathers within living memory say about the succession from Peter onwards. But yeah, I mean, so it depends too, because if I change the dialectic somewhat, right? So for instance, if I say, when I interpret scripture, I'm going to stay within living memory. But then if I'm debating an Orthodox person, I'll say, okay, and then when we interpret how the Petrine charism has been interpreted throughout history, then I'll start including the later patristic witness, right? The later fathers, right? And then what I can do is I can say, okay, look, this is what Peter was given in the 1st century. And then I can make an argument, well, if you're saying that, like, the Petrine successors are seated on the seat of Peter, or they inherit Peter's powers, or whatever you want to say, or they are really in the person of Peter, then I could simply say, well, okay, if that's true, then this stuff in the 1st century that we see, Peter seated on the throne of Moses being prime minister, that's got to carry through, right? If you accept that particular premise, and then it'd strengthen the case then for doctrinal development, because what it would show is, okay, if you have this 1st century deposit, and the later fathers they're sort of catching on, like, okay, yeah, the successor of Peter, he has, for instance, the powers of Peter, or he has the leadership role of Peter. What was intrinsic to that leadership role? What was intrinsic to the powers of Peter? Well, prime ministerial power and the throne of Moses. So then with that concession, you can combine these 2 things together and get a very nice complementary case. So I guess that's something for further research, and I got to look into that. When it comes to then my arguments about Rome, so I talked about how the Jews believed that when the Messiah would come, he would conquer Rome. I think it's true that Constantine's conversion and eventually the founding of Constantinople has to play a part in that narrative. Although clearly with the death of so many apostles and the persecution that was occurring in Old Rome, you have to include both Old and New Rome, so to speak, in this conversation. And I'm sure, like, when they're talking about, when the Jews are talking about here, the Messiah conquering Rome, I think the main image they would have had is the empire itself, right? Which would primarily focus, if it's during the time of Jesus, on Old Rome, right? And not the later kind of creation of New Rome, so to speak. So that would be like saying, for instance, like you have a 1st century source saying the Messiah is going to conquer Rome, and what they intend is Rome where Caesar is, right? And then you say, no, what you mean is this new Rome in Constantinople, right? And it's like, wait, no, that's retrojecting this kind of this 4th century phenomenon into the 1st century. Although I think that it does belong in the narrative, however, because the conversion of Constantine was important for the downfall of the empire at large, or for the conversion of the empire at large, right? So it does belong in the narrative. But the point I'm making here is that you can't really exclude Old Rome from the conversation either. So we got to do both. And if we do that, then I think that provides us strong reasons for talking about how Peter's death in Old Rome and the successors that emerged from there would also have a preeminent place in the messianic rule of Christ. And in fact, I'd say fit closer into not only the narrative on the reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy with Peter as prime minister, but also they fit more into the original intent that we were talking about of the Jewish sources. So then, I guess to summarize then now on the fundamental disagreements between me and Ubi, I think what Ubi and I come down to is two things, right? So one thing is going to be whether or not the explicit consensus of the fathers, and it depends on how explicit we're talking, but let's say, something that's just very nice and clear to the point where you don't necessarily need doctrinal development. All you need is just the consistent witness of the fathers. That's what, like, that's necessary. It's not simply sufficient. It's not simply something important, right? But it's something that you actually need, or else there's no further discussion to be had on the issue. Of course, my perspective on that is that that's much too restrictive. And also, Ubi recognized that the interpretation I offered for the prime minister was compelling, right? So and compelling in the sense that he thought there were some good grounds for believing it. Not necessarily that he was going to accept it as compelling in the sense that necessarily my standard would entail. But then he said, but look, and then people in the audience said this too, but look, if it's not like found explicitly in the fathers and consistently, then we're just not going to admit it, right? And I'm just saying, well, okay, that's a very restrictive standard. And people were talking about citing various other kind of principles, like what was believed everywhere at all times at all places. Well, that in itself was also way too strict, because then you could defeat all, you could undermine a lot of beliefs, or even when people set forward standards, like things that were universally accepted by all bishops, or that sort of thing. Everybody knows like that those kind of blanket principles do not get cleanly applied throughout history. You can get the strong consensus, you can get very strong kind of indications, right? But yeah, so I'd say there that I think the fathers need to be viewed. Well, first, when I interpret the scriptures and I try to discern their original meaning, right? I try to look at the Jewish sources predating the fathers, uh, and also the fathers within living memory, because those are going to be the most important, historically speaking, witnesses. When I want to look at the reception throughout history to eventually get us to Vatican I, then I need to look at the sources beyond just there and see if the first century arguments that I've been giving can help bridge the gap and get us all the way home. Yeah, so then that would be Ubi's kind of first, well, our first fundamental disagreement on the dialectics concerning the fathers. The second fundamental disagreement is going to be whether or not the scriptures have enough on their own, including their surrounding context. So this is not sola scriptura. This is also including the earliest living memory witnesses from the church fathers, and also the Jewish sources surrounding the New Testament and that form the composition of the text themselves. Whether or not this is enough to at least anticipate the development of a prime ministerial office in the church, whether or not this was intrinsic to the nature and composition of the church herself. Now, my stance is going to be regarding the first, that standard's way too restrictive, and I'm not sure if, so if we're trying to talk about what the scriptures say, then that's not going to be the best historical method or interpretation. What you want to do is you want to go to the source within living memory. But if we're talking about getting to the road to Vatican I, then I think, we should talk about all the other receptions throughout history. And then the question for me would then become whether or not there's enough in Scripture to bridge any gaps so that we can say, no, this was intended all along, regardless of whether or not there were disagreements and doctrinal differences and rifts. Yeah, so then, obviously, I would support the second, and then I would say regarding the first that the fathers are important clues for the development of the doctrine itself, right? And I just think that the standard that's offered there is just much too restrictive with respect to the first on the explicit, continuous, and I would say probably like what's presupposed here is complete, right? Consensus. So, for instance, when a Muslim scholar says, well, where does Jesus very explicitly lay out the Trinity, or and then they'll also, they'll ask about where does this explicitly? It's like, well, no, there are pockets of it throughout the scriptures that when you look at them synoptically, they do clearly make this strong conclusion for, for instance, the divinity of Christ, or um, the Trinity, right? So the point that I want to make here then, just to summarize, is that we're going to have to talk about methodology, and we're going to talk about how we incorporate all of these evidences into our conclusions on the sources at hand. I think one strength of the Catholic position is that, the Catholic position, at least insofar as I discern it, what it can do is well, one is that I think the scriptures are often too downplayed. And, people will attribute this to kind of my Protestant background, but I also think that, well, like the arguments, I think that the scriptures written by the first apostles, right? Written by those who knew the Lord Jesus Christ himself or knew the eyewitnesses, they're incredibly important for discerning what was believed by the apostles, which is what the Orthodox, and even Catholics really care about, right? What was really believed by the apostles? What did they teach? What did they believe? What did they pass on? Um, the scriptures, I think, have an incredible power. But I also know, but based on the witness of those within living memory, the scriptures were never meant to be interpreted outside of, right, the historic community, outside of the witness of the apostles and their successors. Nonetheless, right, there's this recognition that the scriptures can speak. There's this recognition that there is this magisterium instituted by Christ to interpret the scriptures. And there's also a recognition then of the tradition of the fathers, which helps serve as an important kind of echo into how we go about interpreting the scriptures and in providing a safeguard for orthodoxy. And I mean, this gets into a lot of discussion on my view of the fathers, right? And also my view on what we mean by the consensus of the fathers and that sort of thing, which I won't get into now necessarily. But the point I want to make is that I think that what happens in the Orthodox position is that there's too much of an overemphasis on the fathers, and I think it's to the point where you say like, well, like if you go to the scriptures, you can't just see what's clearly there. Um, Now they do bring up the point that um, they do bring up the point that heretics would often say, just go to the scriptures, right? Go read. And I'm saying, and I think that's an important kind of counterexample to make, and I think that's something that we need to watch out for, and I need to watch out for and be careful with, right? But I think one of the problems then is that I think that should be judged on a case by case basis, right? So some of the heretics, like like Marcion, right, or these others, I think clearly when we look at the scriptures and evidentially assess them, the scriptures do have a very clear and powerful witness, and that God in his providence has preserved men of orthodoxy to protect, right, the scriptures and what they teach. But I also think that we can discern certain things in scriptures that the fathers might not have necessarily picked up on. And I think that's going to worry a lot of the Orthodox, because they're going to say, well, that sounds like what a heretic would say, right? Like a heretic would say, I could find something in scriptures that the fathers couldn't. And yet at the same time, though, some of the Orthodox today, they'll say, well, Swan, like that interpretation you offer, that's pretty compelling, and the arguments you're using, the sources you're citing, right? I mean, am I really in the same camp, right, as someone like Marcion, or someone like Nestorius, right? I mean, if you want to say that, then I think that then we're going to have to discern more closely, okay, with your principle on the fathers, to what extent would I say your perspective hold up, and to what extent would your perspective be too exclusive or too restrictive, rather, and then to what extent would it actually kind of end up excluding important evidences. So, for instance, I think we can now go into audience reception, right? So this is the second thing that I wanted to talk about. So it seemed for the most part that the audience wasn't interested in like the historical methodology that I was offering. They weren't interested in looking at the kind of method that I was using of a New Testament scholar to discern and interpret what's going on in the original text. A lot of them didn't care for the Jewish sources. A lot of them were like, why are you citing the Pharisees, and so on and so forth. And I think that kind of demonstrates a lack of historical awareness, or consciousness rather, of the text of the New Testament. I think what instead, for them, for a lot of the audience members, the historical context and interpretation would be the fathers, right? But it wouldn't include the first century surrounding Jewish sources and documents that we have, or the Judaism that formed the early church and influenced the first generation of Christians, which I think is incredibly important for understanding how they interpreted the gospel and the message of Christ, and eventually that gets into the church. So, for instance, I brought up the example of Irenaeus, who in the second century, in fighting the heretics, cites this necessity to be able to trace your ordination back to the apostles. We know that the Palestinian Pharisees, during the time of Jesus, through the ordination rite semicha, would demand, right, that the person who's ordaining you, at least one of them, could trace their ordination through Joshua and to Moses. So this idea of tracing, and that was the only way you could be validly ordained to be a judge or a priest. So this idea here, right, shows that the Jewish roots of Christianity actually strengthen our apologetic, because then it's no longer, for instance, someone saying, oh, well, the Christians came later and invented all these things like apostolic succession to protect their power and to consolidate their authority, right, and to suppress heterodoxy. No, what we're doing is we are literally using the historical we're literally translating or passing on the historical lessons of the first century, the teachings that were already there, passed on very likely by Christ or the apostles within that first century period. So that strengthens our case. And what I'm saying here then is that this rejection of the Jewish sources is just an unnecessary self-destructive attitude. And oftentimes, I'm not going to say that this is not a blanket statement about everybody who had this perspective. But to me, it also comes off as somewhat being anti-Semitic, because you have to constantly remind people Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. Many of the apostles were Palestinian Jews, right? I'm not saying that someone like Ubi or the other good Orthodox men that I've contacted and who have reached out to me and used the Jewish sources are anti-Semitic. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that oftentimes in the Christian community, this kind of aversion towards the Jewish sources or this disrespect towards them, not viewing them for their historical value, I'm worried that that's what it either is motivated by or what it ends up communicating to the larger world. Especially, for instance, I have a book titled Jesus the Pharisee by Harvey Falk. And I mean, you'll see the sources talking about, like, these Jewish rabbis are reading the New Testament and they see and they can trace historically the schools of thought that influenced Jesus and the apostles within the first century schools of scribal thought. And they'll say, well, wow, like we didn't, well, one of them, I think it's Harvey Falk, the author or the editor of this source, he says basically, I don't know how you can leave the New Testament and not, hate your Jewish brothers and sisters, which honestly is saddening to read. But then you'll read these rabbis who interpret the New Testament, and they find a kindred spirit. They find, wow, Jesus was a Jew like you, like us, right? And I think that's something that really concerns me and something that I think cannot be downplayed. And not only that, but there are good historical grounds for including the Jewish sources and understanding them. So I don't think that this is a good method for future interpretation, and it's not a good methodology to just throw out the Jewish sources and dismiss them. I mean, which gets into the next point, right? Which is the fathers are of incredible importance to the Orthodox community. And I think that what I need to do is because I've been focusing on only the period within living memory, right? I think if I'm going to switch my apologetic now to historically getting us to Vatican I, right, then I'm going to have to start looking at the later reception among the fathers and how it's been interpreted throughout history. And, people were bringing up to me after the debate, like, well, Swan, you could have cited the Latin fathers. You could have cited these others who recognized that Peter was this leader and head of the apostles, right? And all these other points and pieces. And I think those are good, and I think I need to brush up on my study of the fathers. Although I do want to say here that I noticed that some of the Orthodox audience members complained that, well, one is that they complained about my Protestant background, which I think is unfair. They complained about how I cite mainly evangelical sources or Protestant sources, right? Which is true because I'm trying to cite sources that you wouldn't expect to necessarily be hospitable towards the Catholic position on these issues. Insofar as I can tell, I only know maybe one one or two or three maybe Orthodox New Testament scholars. So the people who are doing most of the studying of the New Testament documents and have achieved prominence in academia are mostly Protestants, then Catholics, then the Orthodox. Um, so that's probably why. But also what I've heard too is that even if you cite these scholars, they're just going to say, well, no, no, what about the fathers, right? And then it's like, okay, so so then that's this is what it really comes down to. It comes down to the fathers, right? For those in the Orthodox perspective. Um, but basically, before I get to that, I mean, one of the things that I emphasize is kind of neutrality. Well, I don't know if neutrality is the best word, but like being fair-minded and open-minded in these kinds of discussions, being fair to one's opponents. And people in the audience were saying Swan's a pleasant guy, Swan's a really nice guy, Swan is intellectually honest, right? I mean, the reason why is because I try my best to be objective and neutral with the sources and careful with them, right? And I try my best to use the methods that are recognized by the historical scholarly community in order to begin making my case for these principles, right? I try to limit, well, and some people will have critiques about this, right? But I try to not go in presupposing my theology, but showing from the evidence and from publicly recognized standards that you can still arrive at these theological beliefs rather than having to already shoehorn them in and through confirmation bias saying, and there's the evidence for it. That's not what I'm trying to do. And so I think that a lot of this rejection of like neutrality ends up, or objectivity, it ends up making us a lot meaner towards our opponents, rude. It makes us full of epistemic vices and not cognizant of our flaws or our confirmation bias coming in. And I think clearly, I mean, it just weakens our case for the arguments at hand. I mean, if you can say to someone, I can take your public standards and still use them to demonstrate my position without having to presuppose my case, that's an incredible apologetic. And so what I find is that in a lot of the kind of audience responses that I got, I just found a lot of self-destructive attitudes, a lot of arrogance and just unpleasantness. And I remember even too, someone, people were saying in the audience like, "Oh yeah, Swan's really smart. He's going to become Orthodox soon, or whatever," that sort of thing. Well, I mean, I appreciate the compliment, right? But in my debates with Protestants and Muslims, all of them have said, "Swan, you're a really smart guy. You're eventually going to join our side, right? Or you'll eventually see what I'm talking about." So I don't appreciate that comment because I've heard it from everybody, and it doesn't seem to me to be an honest approach to the evidence. And some people in the comment sections too were talking about how Swan mishmashes evangelical theology or all these other things, right? And I mean, when you can come up with those one-liners and zingers and rhetoric, then it's like, those blanket statements that sound catchy. Yeah, I mean, you can get away with that with an audience and you can preach to the choir. Um, yeah, so I mean, um, I think the point that I was trying to make with that is that, in these discussions, it's really easy to get away with making these broad general statements, right? But what we need to do is investigate the precise premises and points in the argument and discern more closely, why don't you accept this? But why don't you accept that? Okay, and then, but you reject this on the grounds of X, but then you accept Y on the ground of X. So why not accept, whatever, that sort of thing, right? Um, I think that the dialectic, the debate needs to mature. It needs to grow up. It needs to become more um, scholarly and acknowledge, right, kind of the importance of method here in all of this. Um, yeah, okay, so then I think one of my overarching takeaways is that one, I need to develop now this work on doctrinal development. So what I need to do is I need to not just stick to the first century and that which is within living memory, but begin expanding all the way to Vatican I and showing that what the seed that was planted here is enough to develop through into Vatican I. That's what I'm going to have to do. So I'm not, and I don't know, doctrinal development to me just seems incredibly plausible. And perhaps there's some questions there. But for instance, for a Protestant, right? They view the scriptures alone, and I'm not trying to be too general here, but they view the scriptures alone as this kind of platonic, timeless source of truth, right? And it comes to the point then where oftentimes among at least lay Protestants. They'll minimize the Jewish sources. They'll minimize the historical context. They'll also exclude the earliest church fathers from even within living memory, right? And that causes a problem because this Platonization of Scripture um, produces huge problems, as I've mentioned before, in rejecting and not understanding the text as it should properly be understood. The Orthodox, from what I've heard, they have this view that like everything in so like there wasn't basically any development, so to speak, but it was more just clarifying what was already complete and full in the first century, right, in the time of the apostles. But this idea, right, that something like the papacy, well, okay, so I mean, I'm kind of perhaps sympathetic to that because I don't want to say that the papacy is an innovation in the sense that St. John Henry Newman would describe an innovation as. So then I think what's going to happen is it's going to be this question on whether or not everything needed to have been immediately understood or even fully consistently understood throughout history, right? So that's the question that's going to come down to. So I think what I need to do is I need to defend an overarching theory and explanation of the doctrinal development of the papacy. Now, my current research is focusing on, for instance, the concept of infallibility in Judaism during the time of Jesus. And the reason why I really care about this particular project that I'm working on and the things that I'm studying, especially my book on Seneca there, which is very hard to find. Um, the reason why this matters, at least the research that I'm doing, is that if you can show rabbinic infallibility was around within the first century, or at least this idea, then when Jesus says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, we could honestly say with historical, let's say, certainty, right, historical certainty, that Jesus was talking about infallibility, right? And we mean infallibility in the sense that the Orthodox and the Catholics have understood it, not in this kind of, they're kind of watered down Protestant sense in which it's kind of like only the apostles had infallibility, or only this or that, or it's like no, well, the Jewish rabbinic concept of infallibility sounds more like the Orthodox and the Catholic perspective than the Protestant perspective. That would strengthen our apologetic. Although one issue that I found in the course of my studies is that rabbinic infallibility is a hotly contested issue, even in the past in Judaism. So what seems to be the case is that on one hand, like the Jews were saying, yeah, the high court's infallible. It can reveal the will of God. And then on the other hand, it says, well, no, we got to prepare if the high court makes an error, right? So there are all these things that are going on. And when I look at this, I'm kind of like, well, this kind of reminds me of the development of the papacy. Because on one hand, you'll have people saying incredible and strong things about the person of Peter, about his ministry, about the Petrine successors. On the other hand, you'll say, but we can also do this and that, and Rome's not the only place that we can appeal to, right? And then you have these two sources just kind of going back and forth all at it. And the point here is that if we can use this analogy of like, well, okay, look, it strengthens our apologetic to have this concept of rabbinic infallibility. And the concept of rabbinic infallibility also went through development and hot disputation. But nonetheless, we recognize that it is crucial for our case for Christianity, all right, and our case for what we believe is Orthodox and Catholics. What I could say then is that, well, you look, just because the papacy was hotly contested and this or that, it doesn't mean that this could not ultimately arrive at an incredibly important doctrine for the entire church, right? Just because it's hotly disputed and contested, that does not mean that we can exclude the papacy from at least more serious consideration. Just as with rabbinic infallibility, it was hotly contested but incredibly important for our apologetic and forming the first century Jewish context of the scriptures. Yeah, so I think that one thing I want to do is just, continue studying more. I recently got a lot of books. I'd like to start reading them, although we're approaching finals week in university, so that might be tough. And then, I really found, so Louis Reweb, he did a great job just emphasizing that the audience needs to be mature and charitable. And he did a good job. And people in the audience appreciated how I treated Father Deacon Ananias Sorum. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, I love the Orthodox. I love the liturgy. I love Um, I love, I really love the Orthodox. Like, I mean, it's not a joke. Um, I really appreciate them, and I really am happy to see that at least for a lot of Protestants who are struggling with Catholicism, they can at least go to Orthodoxy and find apostolic succession, veneration of icons. I mean, beautiful, wonderful things that make the tradition of Christianity so full and rich. You know, I appreciate it. I really do love the Orthodox. But I really found it unfortunate how at least the online chat and comment section kind of treated me. On the other hand, though, Lewis, Ubi, and other Orthodox men that I've talked to, they've been very kind to me, very nice, very serious, scholarly, and I know that I shouldn't judge the entire community based on, the comment section, because of course everybody knows the YouTube comment section is kind of, well, it's not the best place for scholarly discussion. But then again, like my YouTube comment section on my channel, I absolutely love. I love it, and I think I have one of the best online YouTube communities because I've never really seen really bad comments from people who even disagree with me, from liberals, Orthodox, Protestants. They'll just say, "Wow, I really appreciate what you had to say. This is really good. This is really interesting." So I think I do have one of the best online YouTube communities. So thank you. Um, yeah, and I mean, so this kind of reminds me of, growing up, I hear about how William Lane Craig wouldn't want to debate like online atheists or that sort of thing. Although he's kind of expanded a little bit lately to like, Alex O'Connor and others like that. But I kind of understand where Craig is coming from because when you try to debate like online folks, and I'm not talking about Ubi here. I'm talking about just like the general online community. When you try to debate and have scholarly discussions there, people just aren't interested. It becomes ugly. It becomes um, all sorts of things, right? So I can understand why Craig would rather debate scholars. And I think in the future, I'm going to be talking soon to Lee Martin McDonald, who's the world's leading expert on the New Testament canon about scripture and that sort of thing. And I'd be excited to talk to him about all of this. And it's my preference that, if someone's not going to respect kind of the scholarly study of scripture and they're going to kind of retreat back into their echo chamber, then it's not worth my time. And especially the work that I'm doing and the scholarship that I'm trying to uncover, I think it's too important to be wasted on um, on people who don't respect me or don't respect kind of the methodology that I'm using or don't want to engage it, right? Or who openly advocate or live within epistemic vices. So, for instance, Jay Dyer during the debate, I saw in the replay, he said something like, "Gematria proves the papacy." Um, I made the argument that Matthew's authorial intent was to emphasize the Davidic kingship of Christ, which in turn, I believe, in my dialectic, emphasized also the creation of the or rather the literal physicalness of the also Davidic prime ministerial office. But to say like Gematria proves the papacy, as if I was making a kind of like a 1-2 AB argument, that's not fair. And so people have asked me like, will you debate Jay Dyer? And I think honestly, I've only like when it comes to my arguments on typology, my arguments on the Jewish sources, I'd say about 75% of my online reception has just been insults and personal attacks. 25% of them, maybe, like I think 10% of them are kind of like interested in the sources and they'll ask me for the sources and I'll happily give it to them. Um, some of them will have the sources and ask a question about it, which I appreciate, right? But like the fact that I'm mostly getting just insulted and mocked for using typology or citing the Jewish sources, I don't appreciate that. And yeah, so I mean, and as someone who's also really interested in being kind to others in this discussion and discerning the truth, because I'm honestly like people who said that I was intellectually honest, like I am really trying my best, right, to study and to explore the sources. And if you want to reach me, then I think you're going to have to at least make the case for either me changing my methodology, right? Or at least approach me with my methodology and proceed from there. Yeah, but I mean, like this widespread kind of suspicion of scholars, I'm not a big fan of that. I mean, the scholars need to be taken with a grain of salt because I don't agree with everything scholars say as well. And then the key point then is showing that I'm not doing this arbitrarily or in a loaded sense. I'm not doing this in a loaded way such that I'm necessarily having to presuppose my beliefs already, right? I'm doing this in a way that's fair-minded and scholarly and approaching the sources fairly, right? I think that's really important. So to summarize my review of the debate, I think yeah, it's going to come down to between me and Ubi, our role, the role that we place on the fathers in the interpretation of the text, but also the prior, I think, Jewish background of the New Testament. And then it's going to come down to whether or not there's enough within the first century to at least um, combining that with the patristic witness to eventually get us to the papacy, or to the Vatican I papacy. Because if you make the argument that you have this prime minister who can sit on the throne of Moses, and then let's say the later fathers talk about Peter is seated, on his seat, right, in his cathedra, um, which actually I think there is a fourth century father who talks about that. But anyway, if you find this consistent witness about Peter being a leader, about Peter being this or that, and then you say, but if you include then the context of the scriptures combined with the witness of the fathers, then you essentially get a doctrinal development view where the prime ministerial office was slowly being understood over time, where the throne of Moses, the cathedra of Peter, was slowly being understood over time and built into its climax in, um, let's see here, in Vatican One. But also, someone tried to make the argument about Dionysus and Saint Dionysus, I think, and the three-tiered structure of um, divine institutions. And then I made the point. Well, the Davidic monarchy was also a divine institution because God said it would last forever through one of the sons of David. So, I mean, was the Davidic monarchy three-tiered? If not, then that would count as a counterexample to Dionysus. If yes, then that would just coincide with my case. Because I could say, yeah, and the church is the new Israel, the Davidic monarchy has the prime minister. I don't see what's the problem, right? So it's compatible either way with my interpretation. Okay, let's see here. So then we talked about the fundamental disagreements. We talked about the audience reception, and yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat anything there. And then the overarching takeaways that I had, the study that I want to continue doing, and my kind of disposition towards mainly communicating with scholars on this issue rather than just going into the online community and being insulted. Um, yeah, but I mean, what's going to happen is that I'm always free to talk about these issues, to discuss them with you. I'm always going to be available and here because I recognize that even though the scholars are really important, everyday lay people have very important things to say about this issue and shouldn't be dismissed. I don't want to become an ivory tower guy. I don't want to become a guy who's just always up here in the books, but never with the people or not communicating or taking the time to understand them. And I don't want any Orthodox person watching this to leave and think, oh, Swan thinks low of the Orthodox. I really don't. And I really appreciate Ubi's very high view of the Catholic Church. And clearly, Ubi's not an anti Catholic. And then, unlike some of the conversations I've had with certain people who are clearly anti Catholic and prejudiced, Ubi, once again, I'll say, is one of the most delightful opponents that I've had on this issue. He's a serious intellectual, and I hope that others take him more seriously and treat him with his due respect. And I kindly ask in return that I receive respect and serious scholarly engagement. Yeah, so I think now my study is going to focus on the doctrinal development of the papacy and then focusing more on the fathers. But I really do want to start finishing up my research on the first century Jewish context of the scriptures and begin moving from there. So with that, then I will end this review. Eventually, I'll be going on reason and theology to kind of offer more of my insights and to get what Eric and others have to say about my views in the debate itself. But yeah, um, There's still a lot left to study, but ultimately, I went away from the debate still convinced of my position because I think the biblical witness is so strong and so powerful. And clearly, the fathers are sometimes overemphasized in terms of their disagreements on Peter, but nonetheless, there's this ring of unity on his leadership, his status as prince, and his status as head of the apostles.